Before we begin tonight's program, I'd like to welcome a few individuals here tonight. First of all, Mrs. Mary Jordan. Mr. Jordan's mother is here from Atlanta. Mr. Windsor Jordan, Mr. Jordan's brother, is here from Atlanta as well. Our congressman from the 10th District, Doug Bernard, is here, along with his district representative, Mr. Ted Hammock. And welcome to Dr. Virginia Trotter, also Vice President for Academic Affairs. My name is Tim Mescine, and I'm the coordinator for tonight's program. Over 1 year ago, Dina Kushner, a fellow doctoral student, and myself conceived the idea of promoting a distinguished lecture series to be jointly sponsored by the Association of Doctoral Students and the College of Business Administration. The results of many months of cajoling and lobbying produced a program entitled Business Tomorrow, a Forum on the Future of Business. The primary objective of this forum is to present a variety of academicians and practitioners offering diverse opinions concerning the prospects of the future of business in America. From an initial list of 25 prospective speakers, one name emerged as epitomizing the spirit of this forum. The inaugural address for the Business Tomorrow series would be presented by Mr. Vernon E. Jordan Jr. Mr. Jordan has emerged as one of the nation's foremost spokespersons. As head of the National Urban League since 1972, he has directed an organization with 112 local affiliates, a staff of 3,000, and annual cash disbursements exceeding $100 million. The League's functions are twofold. One, direct service to the black community by way of job training and placement, as well as educational, social welfare, and housing programs, which last year helped 750,000 individuals. And two, advocacy to government, business, and union leaders of the cause of minority economic development. Mr. Jordan, who received his BA from DePauw University and his JD from Howard University School of Law, has received numerous awards in recognition of his accomplishments. In 1977, he received the Alexis de Tocqueville Award of the United Way of America, a special tribute to his leadership in voluntarism. In recent years, Mr. Jordan has received some 30 honorary degrees from such auspicious institutions as Brandeis, Brown, Dartmouth, Harvard, Princeton, and Yale universities. His weekly newspaper column, To Be Equal, is distributed by the Copley News Service to over 600 newspapers, and he has written extensively on national issues for major publications. Mr. Jordan's radio commentaries are broadcast 3 times a week on the Westinghouse Broadcasting Network. Of particular interest to our forum tonight, Mr. Jordan sits on the board of directors of 6 major U.S. corporations, including American Express Company, Bankers Trust Company, Celanese Corporation, J.C. Penney Company, the Xerox Corporation, and Bankers Trust New York Corporation. Additionally, he serves as a director for a number of foundations, including the John Hay Whitney and the Rockefeller Foundations. Mr. Jordan, a native of Atlanta, has had more than a few verbal jousts with fellow Georgian President Jimmy Carter. At the 1977 annual conference of the National Urban League, he declared that, quote, blacks were disenchanted with the administration, believing that their hopes of jobs, urban revitalization, welfare reform, and much else has been betrayed because of a stress on balanced budgets instead of balanced lives. It is indeed a pleasure and an honor to introduce our inaugural speaker for Business Tomorrow, a forum on the future of business, Mr. Vernon E. Jordan, Jr.
Tim, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here at the University of Georgia and to be a speaker. Last time I was on this campus, I had another responsibility. I was a law clerk for a lawyer at that time named Donald Hollowell. And it was January 1961, and we left Mr. Danner's office, and I escorted Charlene Hunter through some of your alumni. So it's nice to be back under better and happier circumstances. As Tim indicated in his introduction, I'm a native of the state. I grew up in Atlanta. I take great pride in my Southern heritage. I take great pride in having been born here and reared here. I hope to die here, but I live in New York, and I never thought that I'd come back home to the South happy that the Yankees won. Both Sherman and I are happy that the Yankees won last night. And it is a measure, it seems to me, of improved race relations when one can be black and not be for the Dodgers. This is obviously an audience that does not remember Jackie Robinson. Had a great time at dinner with Congressman Bernard of the 10th Congressional District. We talked a lot about politics, and we talked a lot about the various campaigns that are going on around the country at this particular time. And it reminded me of a story that ought to be shared with you. It's a story of a polling situation that took place in the ghetto of Harris County, which is Houston, Texas. In 1964, when Lyndon Baines Johnson was running for the presidency was seeking to be re-elected, or elected to the presidency, against Barry Goldwater. The pollster stops this brother on a Houston street and asks this question. He said, if in this presidential election you had a choice of 3 presidential candidates, for whom would you vote? He said, who are the candidates? He said, the candidates are Martin Luther King Jr., Jesus Christ, and Lyndon Baines Johnson. He said, if you had a choice of voting for one of the 3, for whom would you vote? He said, I'd vote for Lyndon Baines Johnson. And the pollster asked why. He said, I would vote for Lyndon Baines Johnson because Martin Luther King Jr. says, seek and ye shall find. Jesus Christ says, ask and it shall be given unto you. But Lyndon Baines Johnson says, stay home, boy, and I'll send it to you. So those politicians, liberal and conservative and Republican and Democrat, might take that in mind. I do consider it a pleasure to be asked to, and a privilege really, to be asked to inaugurate this lecture series about business. You must understand that I'm not a businessman per se, except I do run a large nonprofit, tax-exempt, eleemosynary entity. And while we are not in the profit-making business, and while we do not issue dividends, we do in fact have shareholders who expect some kind of dividends in their daily lives. And so to a large extent, we employ in the process of delivering services to people and the process of advocacy about issues affecting black people and other minorities. We do employ, to the extent that resources will permit, all of the techniques of management that you would find employed in any regular business. If you come to the National Urban League headquarters, you would find management by objective system, and you would find process of decentralized management, and you would find a management information system. I assume that these are the right terms if I'm talking about this. You would find all of that in place. But I've also had some, in the early stages of my days at the Urban League, had some little difficulty in that most of those 3,000 workers that Tim talked about in the Urban League are social workers. I'm not a social worker. I'm a lawyer. All of my 4 predecessors as head of the National Urban League were, in fact, social workers. So we are basically social work oriented. And for a lawyer, that was not without some difficulty. You succeed a great man like Whitney Young. That's a proud and humbling experience. But then to have to talk to social workers is a confusing experience. When I first got to the Urban League, one of the social workers came to my office and suggested that if I was going to be successful, that I would have to adjust my language downward in such a way so as to be able to communicate with the social workers. That was not easy because the social workers use terms like the conceptualization of the problem. They use terms like certain pedagogical influences on various kinds of esoteric phenomenon. They talked about systemic relationships and prioritizing and such esoteric terms as those that I had a difficult time understanding. After a few weeks, we worked it out. And so now, rather hearing terms like the conceptualization of the problem, what you get now is a statement of the problem. But you must state the problem in terms like caveat emptor and res ipsa loquitur and ipso facto. That's what those kids are reading upstairs in this library. 10 years ago, the Kerner Commission report concluded as follows. What white Americans have never fully understood, but what the Negro can never forget, is that white society is deeply implicated in the ghetto. White institutions created it. White institutions maintain it, and white society condones it, end of quote. Today, a decade later, our society still maintains, condones, and perpetuates racially based disadvantage. Instead of marking the start of a new era overcoming the dismal heritage of racial oppression, the Kerner report was neglected, left to gather the dust of indifference. Despite the limited gains made by some, the bitter fact remains that most black people are no better situated in our society today than we were when the Kerner Commission indicted racism and made its plea for America to change. By any measure, equality for the majority of black people in America remains an elusive ideal. Black unemployment is well over double the white rate. Black median family income is below what the government itself defines as a minimum acceptable living standard. And the gap between white and black incomes grows daily. Black youth suffer astronomical jobless rates approaching 2/3 in many inner cities. Black health, housing, and other key indicators continue to be well below white standards. Despite federal job creation policies and such administration initiatives as an urban policy, welfare reform, and others, little concrete action has been taken. The Congress of the United States appears to be a major barrier to progressive legislation, defeating some important measures, gutting others, and adding weakening amendments to still other key bills. The conclusion this past weekend of the 95th Congress of the United States reminds us that while this Congress was not exactly a do-nothing Congress, it also reminds us that this Congress did not do much for the poor, the deprived, and the dispossessed in our land. We're now reaping the bitter harvest of a decade of negativism. 10 long years of withdrawal from the struggle to remake our society. The second Reconstruction that gave black people some measure of progress and sparked bright hopes is dead. In its place, we have a new national debate raging, a debate that holds profound consequences for America's minorities. This debate pits a no longer silent but still selfish majority against minorities. The debate is about key issues: the role of government, inflation versus unemployment, the future of our cities, and affirmative action. But the emotions go a lot deeper. The movement toward greater economic and racial equality touched a raw nerve in American life. We are now witnessing the full fruition of a national backlash against the poor and minorities, a backlash fueled by selfish vindictiveness that is fragmenting our society, a backlash I define as the new negativism. In the 1960s, there was a general consensus shared by whites and blacks alike that an activist government should achieve full employment, reverse the effects of discrimination, and revitalize the cities. Today, that consensus has been shattered. In its place, we see the formation of a new negativism in America that calls for a weak, passive government, that calls for indifference to the plight of the poor, that calls for abandonment of affirmative action, that calls for letting the American cities twist slowly, slowly in the wind. Make no mistake about it, race is central to the rising support of the new negativism. People are not merely saying no to high taxes and inflation. They are saying no to inclusion of black and brown people into the mainstream of American life. And behind that no are the vestiges of a racism that blights American life and casts a long shadow over our pretensions to speak on behalf of human rights throughout the world. This retreat from equal opportunity has profound consequences not just for blacks and minority people, but for our free enterprise economy. America cannot afford to neglect its wasted human resources. America cannot afford to perpetuate discrimination in a world that's 3/4 non-white. America cannot afford to turn its back on its historic ideals of justice and equality. Thus, the private sector has to play a major role in countering the new negativism. It has to seize its responsibilities to do right and to act right. And the private sector has to fulfill the promises it made back in the 1960s when social concerns first surfaced as a corporate priority. Today, the burning sense of urgency that characterized the corporate response to the urban unrest of the 1960s appears to have cooled. With notable exceptions, it seems that many in the private sector have joined the broad institutional retreat from dealing with the social issues of our times. There are many reasons for this. One is obviously the effect of the recession. When times are good, altruism is easier. When they are bad, when business pressures take precedence over all else, involvement in activities seen as unrelated to the core concerns of the business is dropped. That in itself tells us something about the marginal role the corporate sector places on broad national social concerns. Another factor in the retreat was the lack of leadership from Washington. The past decade was characterized by national administrations that followed a policy of benign neglect of the cities and of minorities that legitimatized similar policies in the private sector. A final reason may be the relative intractability of social problems. In the glory days of the 1960s, it was thought that federal funds and programs, coupled with the private sector's application of hard-nosed business approaches, could help revive the cities and close the gap between blacks and whites. That didn't happen because both the government and the private sector refused to commit themselves to steady, long-term attempts to deal with the problems. Many business leaders became disillusioned. They felt that they gave it a try. It didn't work out, and now it was time to cut their losses. But the problems of the cities and of the minorities who live in them are not at all similar to the problems of a money-losing plant or subsidiary. You can't just walk away from them. Dropping concerns that are losers in business means cleaning up balance sheets and assuring future profitability for the corporation. But in the social arena, dropping out doesn't result in cutting costs. It means compounding costs and winding up with ever-increasing losses in the future. And those losses amount to a generation of black youngsters who lose out on job training and work experience, a growing underclass without skills or income, increased tax burdens, and the prospect of major American cities going belly up with incalculable damage to the nation. The cost to our society in terms of wasted productivity, social unrest, broken lives, and urban decay is enormous. And those are costs to American business too. For business, they mean loss of potential consumption, higher taxes, rising crime, and endangered urban assets. I have spoken strongly in favor of greater federal activism to create jobs and to rebuild cities over the years. That cannot be to the exclusion of greater private sector activism. I believe that if the public and private sectors together mount a national concerted effort to deal constructively with the serious internal problems of the nation, the future of the cities will be bright. It is axiomatic that the point at which there is a general consensus about something is the point at which the opposite will happen. Today, there seems to be general agreement that the cities will die. And for that reason, I think there is an excellent possibility they will revive and flourish. It makes no sense for the private sector to write off many billions in urban assets. As land and wage costs in suburban and rural areas rise, and they are rising steeply, cities will increasingly look more attractive economically. And as we enter an age marked by energy shortages and high energy costs, energy-intensive urban areas will regain their economic viability. Our society, public and private alike, cannot continue to tolerate a situation that is so potentially explosive that it threatens the future of American democracy. A pluralistic nation simply cannot survive unless all of its component groups are brought together, each with a fair share of society's rewards and responsibilities. Unless the private sector plays its part in helping to create a society characterized by all of its people having a stake in its success, it faces increased government control, loss of independent decision-making, and deteriorating economic conditions. We have seen it happen elsewhere. What can the private sector do? I'd like to outline just a few steps. First, and perhaps most obvious, is unemployment. Here is another area where the intensity of the 1960s has slackened. Back in the 60s, corporate executives took a look at their workforce composition and saw with horror how few blacks in their companies were above the broom-pushing level. Internal memos and policy statements crackled. Vice presidents were assigned to the job of increasing the numbers of blacks in salaried positions, and the statistics showed a dramatic increase. But the base was so low that tripling and quadrupling the number of black employees looked good on comparative tables, but it still left companies with 4 or 6% black workforces. Progress since then has slowed. The vice president has bucked the job to a lesser executive. Middle management no longer feels the hot breath of the executive office on its neck, and the results can be seen in a recent EEOC study that documents a white-black gap it estimates will take 43 years to close. So one major step corporate leaders can take is to make affirmative action a major company priority. I have no time here to talk about the Bakke case and its implications other than to say that the courts have consistently ruled that racial remedies for the effects of racial discrimination are both constitutional and necessary. It is inconceivable that rulings in employment-related cases will weaken present mandates in hiring. And federal compliance and enforcement agencies have a new prominence in this administration and are aggressively carrying out their responsibilities. Education is tied closely to employment. Corporate involvement in the Urban League Street Academies helped high school dropouts become college graduates. More such business involvement is necessary, from expanding recruitment and assistance to groups working in ghetto schools to backing after-school remedial programs. It seems to me hypocritical for people to say they can't find qualified blacks or women without making the effort to qualify both. Almost as important as creating jobs in the private sector is the question of where those jobs will be. Business must factor impact on social conditions into its sitting equations. The law says that when a new plant is built, there must be an environmental impact statement. I'm suggesting that companies devise internal social impact statements for building, relocating, and other actions that affect the social climate, and that such statements be as important to the final decision as economic ones. 80% of the new jobs are created in the suburbs, but black people are in the cities. Business has to take a new look at this phenomenon. There's no way a business can move to a lily-white suburb and then explain its lack of black employees by the fact that there are few blacks in the vicinity. Steps must be taken to ensure housing opportunities for black employees and to ensure access to jobs for inner-city residents. Joe Louis used to say about Billy Conn, he can run, but he can't hide. That's true for American corporations today. They can run from the cities, but they cannot hide from urban problems. In fact, they may be recreating them. There are some places in this country that have seen suburban concentrations of businesses that left the city. Those suburbs are now themselves small cities and very soon will exhibit all of the problems from which the corporation thought it escaped. It is becoming economically questionable to move to suburbs that are excessively energy reliant and lack the pools of manpower necessary for industry. I expect the suburban boom to bottom out with either a return to the cities or even more likely expansion in rural areas. And this is of great importance to the cities, for siting plants in rural sections with large populations of poor people who have lost their agricultural job opportunities will reduce the flow to the cities and may even act as a magnet, attracting some urban dwellers back to where the jobs are. Another major step business can take is to set aside a significant portion of its outside work for minority firms. When a corporation makes a serious effort to encourage minority suppliers or to place cash deposits in black-owned banks or places its insurance with black-owned insurance companies, it makes a major contribution to the health of the black community. And by providing technical assistance to such suppliers and contractors, it enables them to better compete in the open market. A healthy economy and a thriving private sector are essential preconditions for black advancement. We must, however, recognize the fact that the economy has been healthy in the past and the private sector has thrived, and blacks and other minorities have still been disadvantaged. Recognition of the necessary federal role is growing among corporate executives, and I would suggest that efforts can be directed toward helping to shape that federal role. I have been pleased to find my own calls for expanded federal job programs echoed by industry leaders who admit that they could not create enough jobs fast enough and who want the government to create public service jobs to soak up unemployment. Business has to speak out and openly support the necessary federal role, not only in job creation, but also for the rebuilding of our cities. I used to hear people say that it can't be done, that the cities can't be rebuilt, and there is not enough money with which to do it. Last year this time I was in West Germany, and I saw whole cities emerge from the ruins of war. West Berlin, Dusseldorf, Frankfurt, Mannheim, and other places were largely rebuilt with American Marshall Plan aid, and it is shameful for an American to walk those streets and then come back to our own decaying inner cities. Those cities in Germany were rebuilt with American money, with American finance, with American commitment, and it's very simple to me that if we can do it for the Germans, we can do it right here at home. It can be done. It will take federal funds, and it will take private investment. Corporate America has a role in rebuilding our cities. Corporate America has a role in a national effort that will create work and training opportunities for the labor-intensive tasks to be done. I hope the private sector will see this, not only as something that is necessary for America's social health, but also as an economic opportunity for itself. America's business community needs to encourage some fresh thinking about its role in the new world that's being born. It needs to employ its creativity and its resourcefulness to the new social and economic environment of the future. It will have to understand that our changed economy has made the orthodoxies of the past outmoded. The issue of inflation, for example, needs a broader perspective than that of simply cutting budgets and raising interest rates to induce a recession. When you have people consuming without producing, you get inflation. When the federal government goes into debt to meet an annual cost of $40 billion to pay welfare and unemployment insurance, you get inflation. Contrary to conventional economic wisdom, high unemployment and high inflation go hand in hand in today's economy. I believe that the answer is to put people to work. The answer is to provide the housing, health care, public services, and private production the nation needs, and in the process, to make full employment a national reality. The numbers of enlightened business leaders backing a credit income tax or some other form of guaranteed annual income is growing. Leaders of the business community have backed federal public works projects and public service jobs to cut unemployment. Many business leaders have joined with Urban League and other concerned community agencies to fight racial discrimination and to face up to society's social problems. It is no longer fashionable in the business community to resist change. And it is my hope that you and the generation emerging from today's business schools and law schools will add to their numbers. Most of you will become managers and climb your way up the corporate ladder. And it is for that reason that you should have a sharpened sensitivity to the role of corporations in today's environment. I believe that the future of the system of private enterprise is dependent upon the successful application of the notion of corporate responsibility. If corporations do not creatively interact with the social environment, if they do not creatively participate in dealing with society's social and economic problems, and if they let themselves become obsessed by profit maximization to the neglect of other interests, I believe they are doomed. Social responsibility was not born in the ferment of the 1960s. It is rooted in the concept of the corporate charter. In this regard, I can do no better than to quote to you a statement made by Cora Eklund, president of the Equitable Life Assurance Society, who said, and I quote him, "Basic to the whole idea of corporate responsibility is the fact that the corporate charter, granted pursuant to act of legislature, springs from the power and the express will of the people. The corporation is the creation of the people, and created by them, it is intended to fulfill certain purposes of the people and to perform in ways beneficial to them. They wanted the corporation to produce goods and services of quality and value, but they expected too that overall corporate behavior would be in consonance with the essential welfare of society." End of quote. And I submit to you that the essential welfare of society is not served by environmental damage, by conscienceless pursuit of profit, or by discriminatory practices. I submit further that while successful corporate activity is essential to generate the profits that in turn generate needed goods and services and jobs, the general health of the society is just as essential to corporate well-being. Urban decay, racism, and poverty are as much barriers to corporate success as are low sales, cost overruns, and unfavorable debt structures. I am suggesting here that these are issues of concern to American business and to yourselves as students and future businessmen and businesswomen, and that they are issues that demand informed responses. Those informed responses cannot exist within a framework of thought based on narrow self-interest, selfish indifference to the world around you, and preconceptions rooted in notions of superiority based on race and color. I know that you will have mastered the art of accounting procedures when you leave here, but you must ask yourselves whether you have also mastered the arts of moral accounting as well. Perhaps you have to the degree that observing the scandals that have engulfed some corporations, you recognize a moral responsibility to your own values and ideals that transcends conventional obedience to corporate structures. Perhaps, too, you have seen the ghost of Watergate flicker across the television screen, espousing the moral doctrine that anything is right if it's done by someone who has the power to do it. And perhaps you, too, were repelled by that doctrine and have concluded that you will not allow your moral values to be subverted by orders from above or unchecked ambitions from within. But beyond that personal morality in existential situations lies a concept of moral behavior toward the injustices that still pervade our society. Thus, there is a moral imperative to work for changes in our nation, changes in behalf of those who don't have what you are getting and what your prospects clearly are. Remembering Dante's great words, that the hottest places in hell are reserved for those who, in a time of moral crisis, maintain their neutrality. I ask that you measure your potential success not by your job or status or salary, but by your efforts to overcome our society's heritage of discrimination and inequality. And I leave with you the thought that American industry is the most creative in the history of the world. It has made America the economic center of the world. It has put men on the moon. If it really committed itself, I believe it can find thousands of ways, large and small, to resolve the unresolvable problems of urban blight and discrimination and environmental damage. And based on my experience, I have a faith. I have a faith that says that we can and that we will because we must. And I share that faith with my predecessor, Whitney Young, who said and wrote shortly before he died these words: I do have faith in America, not so much in a sudden upsurge of morality, nor in a new surge toward a greater patriotism. But I believe in the intrinsic intelligence of Americans and the business community. I do not believe that we forever need to be confronted by tragedy or crises in order to act. I believe that the evidence is clear. I believe that we as a people will not wait to be embarrassed or pushed by events into a posture of decency. I believe that America has the strength to do what is right because it is right. I am convinced that given a kind of collective wisdom and sensitivity, Americans today can be persuaded to act creatively and imaginatively to make democracy work. This, says Whitney Young, is my hope, my dream, and my faith. And I'm pleased to be here to share that hope and that dream and that faith with you here tonight. Thank you very much.
I want to thank Mr. Jordan for that moving address. We've allowed about 15 minutes for questions from the audience. Tom Shore and the crew at IRC have done a superb job tonight with preparing videotaping of this, and they've only made one request, and that is those of you with questions, if you would please move to the microphone in the center of the room so we can get all of this on film. We'd appreciate it.
They needed some sort of, my question is, what sort of incentives would you propose for this aid, private aid, to come into the cities to help revitalize them?
Yeah, let me say a couple of things about that. First of all, there is a misunderstanding about who lives in the American city. Too many of our politicians use revitalization of the city synonymously with black. The fact of the matter is that if you go to any American center city, you will see tall buildings and big hotels and fine restaurants. And those big buildings are not owned by black people. We can barely pay the rent. They're owned by white people largely. And therefore, when you talk about revitalization of the American city, what you're really talking about is not revitalization for black people or for white people, but revitalization in the interest of the city, wherein all of us have a mutuality of interest. And it seems to me if there is a recognition of that mutuality of interest, as opposed to passing it off as being a situation where you save something for blacks, it's important that that be understood. It's also important that it's understood that the vast majority of the people living in the American city are not black people, they're white people. Same thing is true about welfare and some other things. Now, to your question, I believe in incentives to private industry to hire and train unemployed, just like you have a tax incentive for new machinery. I believe that, as is in the Carter Plan, a tax incentive for relocation. I think that relocation ought to be targeted. And it seems to me to be one way to get at the problem of the city. There is an interesting phenomenon happening in the city, and that is that middle-class white people are moving back for lots of reasons. And you can go to many, many areas in many, many cities and see areas that were overcrowded and black, that have been gutted, refurbished. The property values have gone up, and middle-class whites and very few middle-class blacks are moving in, which raises the question, where are those black people going? Either deeper and deeper into the ghetto or somewhere else, and nobody knows. They won't get into the suburbs, so it's a question of where, in fact, they're going. I believe that the issue in the city is to make those people in the city middle class, as well as bringing the middle class, both black and white, back. And in that regard, I am for all form of incentives to business to do that. Obviously, you got to have capital formation and capital productivity. I'm for public works. I'm for public service jobs. I'm for various modernized versions of the old New Deal programs, CCC camps, and what have you, simply because I don't think we can write people off in this country, nor do I think that we can increase the welfare rolls or build more jails. And the answer to that, I think, is jobs.
Thank you.
You said that you gave a lot of suggestions about what companies can do to reverse this negativism. You gave a lot of suggestions, and you also said that the companies should support the government. But in the past, in the 60s, the companies did have to have incentives. And what I'm asking is, do you think that the companies will do this on their own in the 70s? In essence, what I'm saying is, do you think there should be more federal input saying, do more of this, instead of asking them to do it, should government tell them to do it?
Well, I think first of all, it has to be recognized that to the extent that we have made progress in this country, it is a direct result of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. All of these companies that I'm talking about, including those on which I serve on boards, did not all of a sudden decide that they ought to hire me and you. I mean, they did not hear from heaven and say, what happened is that they were responding to the law. And I happen to think that the law and the reorganization that has taken place amongst civil rights agencies then the law is pretty clear. I think it's a question of leadership. I think it's a question of reminding and pushing and prodding. And much of that leadership I put at the feet of the President of the United States, the governors and the mayors and the congressmen to give us leadership. And I think that we're not getting that leadership because all of our leaders that we elected are trying to figure out where the people are. And once they try to figure that out, then they run and catch up and get in front of them and say, I am your leader. They think. And so I don't want any more government regulation than I need. I would like a minimum of that. But what brings about government regulation is behavior. We never would have had to have the Voting Rights Act of 1965 if the governor of Georgia had let me and you vote. Not you too young yet, probably. But we never would have had to have that federal law. But the federal law came in the obstinance and unwillingness of people to recognize situations. So I think that to the extent that we do not get the kind of movement, that you in fact invite a kind of federal activity and a kind of regulation. And I see it every day in my work where people take obstinate positions. And as a direct result of that obstinance, we get regulation. And the regulation always tends to be far in excess of what the excess was. You got Watergate in this country. And instead of having limousines now in Washington, you have bugs that nobody can ride in. And the issue was not the limousine, the issue was lying. You can lie on a scooter. Well, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I've always been led to believe that inflation and the tendency toward full employment was, in fact, an inverse relationship. And you mentioned somewhere in your lecture that they go hand in hand. Could you explain that?
Yeah, most times we've had double-digit inflation. We've had double-digit unemployment. After the recession, when inflation went down, unemployment went down. The problem with inflation right now is that the inflation is all in essentials. It's in food, it's in energy costs, it's in health costs, and poor people have a difficult time bearing that more than anybody else. If the energy bill goes up, he doesn't have any options. He's got to pay the energy bill and cut back on his food bill. whereas you and I might have some options because we got a larger base from which to deal. And I don't believe that inflation ought to be dealt with on the backs of poor people. I clearly understand also the dangers of inflation. Part of the difficulty is that on the issue of, I'm not an economist, I'm a lawyer, but on the issue of inflation versus unemployment, the economists are confused about the issue and cannot give us, it seems to me, leadership, so we are caught up between the Adam Smiths and the Kinses and what have you, and we're all confused about it. What I do know, and what I do believe, that the more people working, the more people are spending, and the better economy you got. I also know that if people are not working, and if people are unemployed, and if they're hungry, then you get another kind of decay that I don't think we want to deal with in this country.
Good evening. I'm with OIC here in Athens, and we deal with employment almost every day. Now, my question concerns a statement you made that you support public service employment. Now, I'm asking this because the move now through the feds is to move away from public service employment to private industry advisory councils and the transition of people who are unemployed to the private industry. Now, we're wondering now, can the private industry support, I think your statement was that the private industry cannot create enough jobs at that fast of pace. Now, is this a move maybe by the feds to cop out or lay the blame on private industry? They aren't creating the jobs.
There is, what you really have reference to is Carter's $400 million program,
Right.
Which is a sort of a cousin to CETA. CETA, for the most part, is public service jobs, government jobs. The $400 million program is basically private jobs, and the $400 million is incentive money to private industry to in fact hire. I think that's all right. Now, there's some problems with the program as it's been presented by the president and as it is before the Congress, and that the local councils are only made up of business people and labor people to the exclusion of OIC and the Urban League and other community-based organizations. I happen to think that that's a mistake. I happen to think that the experience of the National Alliance of Businessmen has proven that to be, in fact, a mistake, and that community-based organizations ought to, in fact, and should, in fact, be involved, because to the extent that the program is going to work, is going to depend upon people like yourself who run local community-based organizations to make it work. I don't have any problem with the concept. I do have some problems with the modus operandi, but if the Javits Amendment is, in fact, operative, we may even get the CBOs included.
My question deals with the personal incentive of a person to bring themselves up, or personal drive. Where would that fit into this on the person's part?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of talk about personal incentives, and there are a lot of people who say to black people, if you just get up off your duff, everything will be all right. But that's not exactly the case. It takes more, I think that's what you have reference to.
No, that's not what I have reference
okay,
to.
you tell me.
I'm talking about, I'm not going on a racial line or anything. I'm just saying, basically, if I want to bring myself up from where I am right now, I would have to do it on my own drive, basically, my own willpower. Where does that fit into anybody on any line in something like this? In other words, from bringing yourself up from here or up here to up at a higher level.
Yeah, well, I think we're talking about the same thing. I mean, I am really for people bringing themselves up by their bootstraps, and I believe in hard work and sacrifice and working overtime and practicing hard and learning your job and all of that. But I also know, certainly based on the black experience in this country, that you can do all of that and still get turned down at the hiring gate, which has absolutely nothing to do with your incentive or your LAST score or what have you. And I think that is a major problem. Incentive, on the other hand, in this country relates to some other things. I happen to think that there has been a general mistake made in education in this country, and that we all tell our children that the only way to be a success is to go to college. I happen to think that all of us ought not to go to college. I live right downtown in New York, and yesterday we had our windows washed. I am absolutely convinced that the window washer makes more money than I do. So does the locksmith, and so does the landscape engineer. When I was in Georgia, we called him a yard man. So I think that there's been some misdirection in that regard. But in terms of your question about people working hard and doing that, I'm all for that, and I encourage that, and I think that that has to happen. But I'm also sufficiently sanguine. I think about what has happened historically in this society and what goes on even today, and I suspect will be going on to some extent tomorrow, that something happens at some point to some people. Now, it's better than it was. But if you look at just the comparative figures between white youth unemployment and black youth unemployment in terms of which has gone down fastest, there's a direct relationship on the question of race in that regard. But I am for all of those American virtues about hard work and sacrifice and saving your money. And my mama's over there. She always wrote me and told me, if you make a dime, save 2 cents. And I have done that. But I'm simply saying that there's some other barriers that has been my experience and the experience of others that have not worked so well for us, and that's why you got Title VII and the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and the Housing Act.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's take one more question.
Although I feel the economic argument that you gave is probably the most persuasive one, somehow I still feel that there are other theories or other arguments that could be used to fight this negativism as you described it in America. I was wondering if you care to comment what other, I'm not a business person, so that's one reason I bring this up, although the economic arguments are enlightening. I still feel there's other things in America that have to be brought to bear to defeat this negativism.
Yeah, I think the basic answer to that is leadership. I was very disturbed, for example, in President Carter's State of the Union address when he simply said government cannot solve our problems, it cannot reduce poverty, it cannot do this, that, and the other. And that's very hard for me to comprehend when I know that the government won 2 world wars, it put a man on the moon, it builds planes that flies through the air at fantastic rates. And I do not know where we're going to get the leadership to, in fact, do it. And therefore, I think that that, in fact, is an encouragement of the new negativism. Jerry Brown, a couple of years ago, was talking about this is an era of limits. I think you ought to be saying that this is an era of possibilities. And I believe that, knowing that there is an energy shortage and that we cannot do things the way we've done things, but it simply means that with some leadership that you can, in fact, prepare people to do things. I also think that there is a great paranoia, confusion, ambiguity in American life. We're confused about a lot of things. The party's made us crazy, a little bit, and you can turn on the home box in New York City and see the wrong kind of sex education at midnight. The wives have told their husbands that the children are gone, and I'm 40 years old, and I want to assert myself, and so I'm going to work, and I'm not going with you to the company dinner anymore. We've got energy problems. We are torn, and we're still, I think, caught up in the aftermath of Vietnam and Watergate, and we're a little confused. And that's where I think our leaders come in and tell us and give us some hope and some sense of direction and some vision. I had a very interesting experience last October, a year ago. Those of you who know New York, I was walking back to my office, walking down 6th Avenue to Central Park South, and I went in Central Park. It was a nice October day in New York. And I was in the park about 50 feet, and sitting on the bench was a handsome black kid about 18 years old. And as people promenaded through the park, he would say in a quiet voice, "Loose joint here, loose joint here." And as people went through the park and heard his cry, they would reach in their pocket and give him $1, and he would give them a loose joint. For those of you who don't know what a loose joint is, it's a marijuana cigarette, and, which I'm sure there are none on this campus. At any event, as I approached his bench, he said to me, he recognized me, and he said, "Oh, Mr. Jordan," he said, "I am sorry that you have caught me engaging in this illegal activity." But then he said, "Listen," he said, I see you on television, I read about you in Jet and New York Times and Amsterdam News." And he said, "When you were giving Carter hell down there in Washington," said, "you were talking about me." He said, "I'm 18 years old. He said, I'm a good kid. He said, I want to work. I want to help my mother with her kids. He said, I'm strong and I'm healthy. I've been to the OIC, the Urban League, the NAACP, the Community Action Program, the Vocational Foundation. I've been everywhere in New York I could to find a job, and I cannot find work." And he said, "The only way that I can work my wicket is to sell these joints on this bench." He said, "Now you go back down there to Washington, you tell President Carter about me and about my problems." He said, "That's your assignment." And I thanked him for my assignment, gave him $2. I needed one for my driver. And I went on my way. Now, the logical scenario is this, is that the next day or the next week or the next month, the person approaching that bench was not Mr. Jordan or a prospective purchaser, but a cop who arrested him and sent him to Rikers Island, where he came out a worse kid than he was before he went in, just by reason of the conversation. So when he comes out and he goes back to these various agencies looking for work, they ask him about his record. He's got a record, so if something's available, he comes after the people who don't have a record, and therefore, in the meantime, he does something a little worse. And this time they put him in Attica, maybe for a year, and his cellmate, although he's there for misdemeanor, his cellmate is a guy who is in for assault with intent with a deadly weapon. And during that period of time, he gets beat up, he gets to be a homosexual involuntarily, and all these other kinds of things. So he comes out a year later, He's then 21 years old, disillusioned, bitter, mean, still can't find work. Now, the real problem for this society is, what do we do about him? Do we build another jail and a bigger jail at taxpayers' expense? Or do we find him a job to make him a taxpayer as opposed to being a tax consumer? And if we do not respond to his need and the needs of thousands upon thousands of other black kids and white kids and Chicano and Puerto Rican kids in this country, what we do is write off a whole generation of Americans so that by the time that he's 30, he doesn't give a damn about you or me or your wife or my daughter or the General Motors building. And therefore, these companies on which I serve and to which you're going to work for cannot ultimately operate in a situation bordering on anarchy. So I believe that we have a vested interest, the political leadership, the economic leadership, the educational leadership, a vested interest in the future of that youngster, because his survival goes to the general welfare and to the survival of the entire country. I happen to think that that's the great issue facing us, and I really thank you for letting me come to this campus tonight.
Mr. Jordan has been kind enough to agree to meet with you informally outside for what is now probably cold coffee for 15 or 20 minutes or so. Thank you for coming.